In the spring of 1982, every farmer in Shelby County, Missouri, moved their equipment off the old rail spur that ran behind their fields without being asked twice. There was no law requiring it, no posted notice, no official with a clipboard who came around to check. It was simply one of those things that had hardened over time from a reasonable precaution into something indistinguishable from instinct. The kind of unwritten rule that a community enforces on itself through whispers and sideways glances and the quiet social pressure of men who have farmed the same land beside each other for decades. Generations of farmers had parked their tractors, plows, and harvesters in barns and sheds whenever the railroad came through, and the men who ignored it were talked about in town in the careful, lowered voice way that people reserve for those they have decided are either foolish or dangerous, and sometimes both. Nobody wanted to be that man. Nobody, until now. On a Tuesday morning in early April, 62-year-old Earl McAllister rolled out of his farmhouse in his standard-issue denim overalls, the same pair he wore most days, his hair peppered gray at the temples and his boots already caked with the particular dark mud of a Missouri spring. He had been farming this land for 41 years, which meant he had been moving his equipment off those tracks for 41 years without a single complaint, without a moment of visible hesitation. And he had even taught his son to do the same with the quiet authority of a man passing along something important. Earl had followed the rules of this county his entire working life. He knew what was expected of him and he had always delivered it. But this year, standing in the cool morning air with the rail spur visible from where he stood and his 1948 Farmall M sitting exactly where he had left it the evening before, Earl hesitated. He had done the math. He had done it carefully and more than once, checking the numbers the way a man does when he suspects they are telling him something that the people around him will not want to hear. The thing about Earl's math was that it had its roots in a habit that went back decades, tucked quietly into the corner of a barn where nobody paid much attention. For 20 years, Earl had been collecting spare parts for the Farmall M, every bolt, every hydraulic hose, every old gear that came his way, and working on the tractor in the slow seasons with the patience of a man who understood that caring for a machine carefully and consistently was not a hobby but a philosophy. The tractor had 35 horsepower, could till 4 acres in a single day, and had cost $3,200 new, a figure that translated to something closer to $15,500 in current money, and Earl had restored it to a condition that mechanics half his age would have envied. More importantly, over those years of working with the machine and observing it closely in all kinds of conditions, he had discovered something through sheer trial and error that nobody else seemed to have noticed or bothered to record, that leaving the tractor parked on the rail spur for short periods caused almost no wear at all, provided the engine was off and the brakes were properly locked. It was a small technical detail, easily overlooked, and everyone had overlooked it. Earl had not. The calculation he had run was this: if the tractor stayed on the track spur rather than being moved to the barn and back every morning, he gained 12 extra planting hours in the critical spring window. 12 hours sounds modest until you understand what spring planting in Shelby County actually meant, the narrow seam of workable days between the mud of early April and the dry hardening of late May, when every hour in a field was worth considerably more than an hour at any other point in the year. 12 hours, Earl had worked out, could be the difference between finishing on time and losing part of the crop entirely. "I've watched this land for 41 years, he said one morning to nobody in particular, which was the way Earl often worked through his thinking. "And I know what she can take." His wife Margaret had heard him say variations of that line for as long as she could remember, standing at the kitchen window with her coffee going cold, watching him stand at the edge of the field the way other men stood at the edge of oceans, with the particular stillness of someone who had made peace with something enormous and was simply checking, each morning, that it was still there. She had long since learned that when Earl got that look and started talking to the land, something was about to happen that the neighbors would have opinions about. Word got around the way word always gets around in small farming communities, quickly, incompletely, and with a layer of interpretation added at each telling that made the original fact almost unrecognizable by the time it circled back. What people heard was that Earl McAllister had lost his mind and left his tractor sitting on the railroad tracks, and they reacted accordingly. Dale Hadge, who wore a pressed shirt to co-op meetings and carried a notebook full of other people's experience, turned to face Earl across the room with the particular energy of a man who has been waiting for an opportunity to say something important. "Earl, are you crazy?" he said, loudly enough that the room could hear clearly. "The railroad could come through any day. You'll lose everything." The laughter that followed was not polite. It was the kind that bends a man at the waist, the kind that makes the blood rush from your ears, the kind that is less about humor and more about a crowd's need to establish where it stands. The Hoffman brothers shook their heads in that slow, deliberate way that was meant to be seen. "You'll ruin the spring for all of us," they said, as if mockery were a form of concern. Earl stood by his tractor with his hands clasped behind his back and let all of it roll over him the way water rolls over stone, not because he was indifferent to it, but because he had numbers, and numbers were more solid to stand on than other people's opinions. Then the weather arrived, and it did not arrive kindly. Mid-April brought the worst spring rainfall deficit in 27 years, a dry, hard absence of rain that cracked fields that were normally soaked by the 12th of April and left them pale and difficult. Seed trucks were delayed by washed-out roads on the routes that hadn't dried fast enough. The co-op's diesel supply fell 38% short of what farmers needed due to a strike at the fuel depot that nobody had predicted and nobody could resolve quickly. The farmers who had moved their tractors off the tracks, every one of them, following the tradition, doing what was expected, now found themselves losing time they did not have, moving equipment back and forth in a season where the margin for error had already shrunk to almost nothing. By April 18th, yield predictions for the county had dropped by 24% if planting could not be completed within the next week. Every hour counted in a way that was not a figure of speech but a literal agricultural fact, and the men at the feed store spoke in hushed tones with the tight expressions of people calculating losses they had not budgeted for. One of them muttered that if Earl's tractor was still on those tracks next week, they were all doomed, which was the kind of thing people say when they need someone to blame for a situation that was already underway before anyone had done anything wrong. Earl heard about it, the way you always hear about things said in feed stores, through a neighbor who mentioned it with the careful tone of a man delivering news he isn't sure how to frame. Earl thanked him and went back to his field. Earl planted. The tractor had not moved from the spur, the engine was still sound, every bolt exactly where it had been, every tire holding its pressure as if the machine were making a point on his behalf. He had 12 extra hours in the field during the most critical stretch of the season, and he used every one of them with the unhurried precision of a man who has spent 4 decades learning exactly what a particular piece of land needs and when it needs it. His wheat went in row by row, each furrow aligned with the kind of accumulated knowledge that cannot be written down or taught in a classroom because it lives in the hands and the eyes and the bones of a man who has shown up to the same ground in every season for 41 years. By the 1st of May, Earl had finished all 142 acres. His neighbors were still struggling to plant half their fields. The numbers, when they came in, were the kind that end arguments. Earl's yield reached 56.2 bushels per acre. The next best farmer in the county managed 41.3. In dollar terms, that translated to $10,230 net for Earl against $5,125 for a neighboring farm of comparable size, not because Earl was lucky, and not because the weather had favored him specifically, but because he had been 12 hours ahead of a crisis that punished everyone who was 12 hours behind. The tractor was untouched. Not a single bolt had loosened. Not a single tire had flattened. The railroad itself, perhaps embarrassed, sent a letter noting that no incidents had occurred on the spur during the relevant period, A quiet official acknowledgement that the danger everyone had warned Earl about had not materialized, which in the context of everything that had been said about him was a small and satisfying document. Earl cleaned the equipment carefully after the harvest, made a mental note of what had worked and what he would do the same way next year, and said nothing to anyone about being right. He let the land speak for him, because it always had. By June, Dale Hatch came to Earl's barn alone, his notebook folded awkwardly under one arm, his pressed shirt slightly less pressed than usual. He stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking, and what he said was that he had miscalculated, and that he thought the county needed to look at Earl's methods before next season, and would Earl be willing to help? Earl nodded. Not a grin, not a word of reproach, not even the slight shift of expression that would have told Dale he was being made to feel what he had made Earl feel in that co-op meeting. Dale left with relief and shame mixed together in the particular proportion that honest men carry when they know they owe someone more than they can easily repay. The Hoffman brothers came by separately and quietly, asking about storage and scheduling, and Earl answered their questions with the same patience he brought to everything. He was not a man who needed his moment. He had already had it, out in the field, alone with the tractor and the cracked earth and the narrow window of planting days, where none of the laughter had followed him. 10 years later, Earl's son runs the operation with the same careful logic, the same record-keeping, the same conviction that the land rewards attention and punishes assumption. He keeps his father's original notebooks in the top drawer of the farm desk, the pages soft at the edges from handling, the numbers written in Earl's compressed, even handwriting that never wasted space on a page any more than Earl wasted time in a field. The co-op now holds a seminar for younger farmers under the name Earl's Method, which covers calculated risk, precise equipment maintenance, and the kind of timing that can only come from watching a specific piece of ground through enough seasons to understand what it is actually asking of you. The farmers who attended are often surprised to learn that the whole thing started with a man who simply refused to move his tractor and was willing to stand quietly in a room full of laughter until the numbers proved him right. Sometimes what looks like stubbornness from the outside is something closer to certainty on the inside. And sometimes a tractor left on the tracks is not recklessness at all, it is just a man who did the math, trusted what he found, and had the patience to wait for the season to agree with him.